This is the Vic Fazell Show podcast, hosted by Vic Fazell and Jonathan Zimick. Sponsored by Moroso Wood-Fired Pizza, Pinewood Coffee Bar, and the law offices of Vic Fazell. Hugh, I'm so excited to be here with you today. Get to hear you tell your observations about not only Henry Lee Lucas, but we're going to be talking about Ted Bundy and about your involvement with the coverage of the John Kennedy assassination. You were actually a witness to that, weren't you?
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, I actually didn't see the president, but had I looked up at 2 o'clock, I could have seen Oswald in the window.
So you
was
were
in
there.
The center of the street there. That was a hectic day.
Tell us what you were doing back then. What brought you there?
I was the science and space editor for the Dallas Morning News, and I covered all the space flights all during that decade. And I had an interview at SMU with some space scientist. Don't recall who. Certainly didn't show up. And I decided at the last minute almost that I was only 4 blocks from where he would be passing, and that everybody ought to go see the president. So I hightailed it over. The crowds were vociferous. They were 3 and 4 and 6 and 7 deep. So I had to keep going. And I saw a couple of lawyers that I knew, and I sort of followed them over to the Elm Street. And that's where I stood. Center of Elm Street, and I looked up at the window. I could have seen him. I didn't, of course, because the
Joanne, you could have seen Lee Harvey.
Yeah,
Lee Harvey Oswald.
I was watching the Kennedys had just passed me, but it was about 4 cars later, and I heard the shots. And I wasn't sure. The first one I thought was a car backfiring, but then there were 2 others. And I knew there were shots. So I didn't know what to do, really, because I had no pencil or paper. I'd just gone over there to see the motorcade. And I saw a little boy just close to me. His daddy was holding him, and he had one of these big old pens on a pencil, rather, and a little flag. And I just took it from him, gave him 2 quarters, and took off, knowing that I had to find someone to talk to.
So you were actually there and heard the shots.
Heard the
shots. You thought the
shots.
first one was a backfire.
We didn't know where in the world they were coming from. And I saw this man pointing up to the window, right across the street. So I ran to him, and he was the one that described Oswald. Saw him, he was sitting on a parapet there, and right across the street he saw him. And he described him perfectly. And then when he found out I was with the Dallas News, he said, "Oh, get away, get away." He was scared for his family, he said. Later we became friends, but he was afraid for his family.
Wow.
So 2 cops pushed me away from him. Well, that was lucky too, because then I started interviewing other people. Nobody knew what had happened, really. They saw the damn car speed off and nobody knew. But on the motorcycle radio came the report from Oak Cliff a few minutes later. Officer been shot, I think it's bad, or something of that sort. So I said to myself, if someone shoots at the president here, and we didn't know his condition, whether he'd been hit or not, but if someone shoots at the president, and then someone shoots a cop 3 or 4 miles away, there's a chance it could be connected. So my car was 4 blocks back to News. I didn't have a way to get to Oak Cliff. So I ran into 2 Channel 8 guys that had a mobile unit. And I said, "Did you hear what just came over the radio?" And he said, No, what? And I said, "Cop killed over in 3 or 4 miles over in Oak Cliff." They said, "Come on." And we, the 3 of us, went like wild to Oak Cliff. We got there in time to see the woman that had seen him up close, two sisters who'd seen him.
And by him you mean Lee Harvey Oswald?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that was an interesting afternoon. And we searched through buildings, 3 or 4 of them, and finally, I remember going into an old furniture store. It wasn't a sales place; it was a storage facility for old furniture. And they thought they had a report that whoever it was in there. So we go in there. I'm going in there. I'm up the steps. And I look around, and I know some of these cops, 8 or 9, 10 cops, and me. They all got guns, and I don't.
Oh, my.
Well, I was a little hesitant.
Yeah.
Then we get inside the door, and almost immediately, one of the cops that had been there earlier from the back, fell halfway through the floor. And everybody had their guns out. It's one of them didn't shoot him. And at that point, I said, look, I'm getting out of here. Everybody here's got a gun, and I don't have a gun, and I'm scared to death. So went outside, and luck was with me again. I went up to an FBI guy. I knew he was sitting in his car, his radio on, and he was getting a report that there was a suspect in the Texas theater.
Texas theater.
And so I thought, geez, I hadn't eaten breakfast that morning. I was hungry. I'd drinking a lot of coffee. I was almost weak. I thought, I gotta go. But it's 8 or 9 blocks. So I went 8 or 9 blocks. And I remember going up to the woman selling tickets. Her name was Julia Postel. And I said, he's in there. She said, and I said, did he buy a ticket? Stupidest thing I ever asked. And she said, no, you don't understand. He's in there. So about that time, I ran into a guy who was manager of the shoe store. His name was Johnny Brewer. And Brewer was the reason that Oswald got caught. Because he was alone in his shoe store, 4 doors down from the theater. And he saw every time the police cars, they were going, crazy. Every time one went by, Oswald would sort of hide into the recesses in front of his store. So he ran up, and he's the one that told him he thought this was somebody involved. So I go inside the theater with Johnny Brewer.
And there are no cops around yet?
Oh, yeah, there were cops.
There were cops there?
Cops there.
Oh, good.
Yeah, there were a lot of cops there. And I didn't see them all because most of them went in the back, came out on the stage. They had stopped, they had turned the lights semi on. And there were only about 13, 14 people in the theater at the time. And I went first to the far door, looked in because there were more people sitting over there. No activity at all. And then I saw people coming off the stage. 2 or 3 cops, guns drawn. And one of them stopped just before they got to where Oswald was. And by that time, I'd moved down to this door. I was about 15 feet from Oswald when they jumped on him. Now this cop, Nick McDonald, was real smart. He stopped and talked to a couple, 3 or 4 seats in front of Oswald. Probably saved himself from getting shot. Anyway, he jumped on him. Immediately, cops came from all directions. And it was just like one of these things you used to see in a comic book where an arm here and a leg there, everybody shouting something. I only heard Oswald say, I was 15 feet away. Oswald said, I protest this police brutality. He said it twice. And it was brutal. They knocked him down. They stopped him from firing. Somebody got in a firing pin in his gun, saved McDonald's life.
Wow.
And they got him out of there. And I never understood why, but one of the cops was running in front of him with his hat off in in front of Oswald's face so nobody could see his face. And I kept thinking, what in the world does that matter?
So what happened next?
Well, I found out where, I don't know how I found it out. We had people back in the office. We had people all over the place by that time. Found out where Oswald had lived. So they gave me the address and I went there. That was probably 8 or 10 blocks from where he shot Tippett. And I go in and the woman that ran the place.
Now Tippett, he was the policeman.
Tippett was a policeman that was shot, and he was dead and already taken away by the time we got there. We didn't get there, it was probably 20 minutes after the shooting. Because remember, we got the call, we were at the depository building.
Right.
And we got there pretty fast. I went to the place on Beckley Street, West Beckley. The woman came in and I said, I'm looking for a guy named Oswald. She said, we don't have anybody. Nobody stays here by that name. And I said, now look, I know he lives here because the address was in his belongings that the police told me about. She said, well, that sounds like Mr. Lee. And he had signed in as O.H. Lee in the book. She tried to give me that book. And I said, no, I think the cops are going to want that book.
Yeah.
Anyway, I interviewed a couple of people that lived there. And just like everything else in this case, what she told me then certainly wasn't what she told other press people as they came along. She made up stories about the police coming to get him, help him escape. And we had to run those down, of course. Found out that what she saw, car number 11 or whatever she told me, they didn't even have one of that number, But it was the beginning of a long weekend.
Were you a witness to the Jack Ruby shooting, Lee Harvey?
I was a witness only that I was behind about 3 people. In those days, the photographers had these huge cameras, heavy. So everybody was fighting for a position. I was in the basement, I was behind them, and I did not see Ruby for several seconds after they split and started shooting,
But you heard the shot.
Yeah, I heard the shot. And it was just a little plink-like shot. And I'd known Ruby for years. I wasn't too surprised, but never liked him.
How'd you know Ruby?
Well, he was at the Dallas Morning News and the Dallas Times-Herald constantly. He would run little ads about 3 inches, 1 column, his strippers. And I remember he used to take Tony Zoppi to lunch. He was the entertainment writer. And he was up there twice a week anyway.
So Jack Ruby owned a strip joint?
Yeah, he owned strip joint and an after-hours club out on Oklahoma also. But I'd seen him, I'd known him. I was probably in his club twice. One time I saw him, he would get mad and attack people. He knocked one guy down. I don't know what he'd done. Maybe he'd touched one of the strippers or he'd made some kind of remark. Ruby took him, and he was drunk, and threw him down the stairs, and the stairs in that place were like this. They were just, it was
Steep.
very steep. And the guy was hurt. He got up and wandered away, but I never forgot that. Ruby was a show-off, but later on he became helpful to me.
So you were at all 3 of the major events. The killing of our president, when Lee Harvey Oswald was captured at the theater, and then when Jack Ruby shot him. You were present at all 3 of those.
Right.
Wow. Now, I was with you not long ago. Time flies. It could have been a few years ago at the book depository. They turned it into a museum. They were honoring you that night, were they not?
I don't recall. I've been there so many times.
How old were you back then?
32.
Wow.
Young and hungry.
Young and hungry, especially that day. And then eating breakfast. Tell me about how you got involved in the Ted Bundy case.
I didn't know anything about Bundy. I had a young guy work for me at Newsweek. I was a bureau chief in Houston, and Stephen Michaud was right out of college and was assigned to me, and we worked together on a couple of murder stories in Houston. And then Bundy came along, and I just didn't know who he was. It looked like he was wrongly accused because of his background. He'd been a Republican worker. He'd been a law student for a while. And he was, people that knew him said that couldn't be Ted. That just couldn't be. Well, by that time, Stephen Michaud had ended his trial with Newsweek, went to New York, and came up with a publisher that was interested in Bundy. And he called me.
Michaud is a journalist.
Huh?
Michaud is a journalist.
Michaud's a journalist. He was with me at Newsweek, and we've written probably 5 or 6 books together. And he called me one day and said, "Hey, so I got a call from Simon & Schuster. They want to know, they want someone to write a book about this guy. Have you heard about Ted Bundy?" And I said, "Well, not a lot. I know he's from the Northwest, and I know he's a handsome dude, and people think he's innocent, a lot of them." Of course, in those days, the problem was that they didn't have instant touch with departments and different agencies and everything like they do today.
Oh yeah, it's instantaneous communication today.
But anyway, that started us. I said, "Well, let's talk to them," and we did. And primarily, I think, because of my work on the space program and the Kennedy assassination, that sold him that I could help him do it. So that's how we got together. And then we had a problem because the average person can't just walk in the Florida State Prison.
Right.
You know? So I got this idea. I was a licensed private eye at that time in Texas. I did that to get access. And I thought it'd probably work in Florida too, and it did. And I got Stephen, my partner, signed up as a private eye also, so we could come and go. And so we spent almost 100 hours with Bundy in a little old room half as big as this.
What was he like to talk to?
Well, at first, he was very arrogant at first, but we sent Stephen in first because Stephen had been born up in the Northeast and at a young age had moved to Tacoma, Washington. And that's the same thing as Ted had done. He'd moved, his mother was in Washington area, moved to Tacoma, Washington. So they grew up together.
They had
Stephen
that connection, yeah.
And they knew some of the same people, and it was a little uncanny, really. We thought, boy, that's another plus. Now we got access. Now we got people, you know. So Stephen went in for the first half of our interviews, 30, 40 hours. We couldn't budge him. He wouldn't talk about anything but he was innocent. And he talked about all his old buddies and what he thought in school and stuff like that. And then it was my turn to go in. And what I had with me, I had gone to Washington, Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and Montana, I think, interviewing cops, testing, reporting on all the deaths that were thought to be Bundy's. So when I went in there, the jig was over because we didn't talk about his innocence, which riled him up quite a bit. He was very angry with me from day one. But
he kept seeing you.
He kept, the ego. We used his ego against him. And I remember, I started to tell you this a little bit ago, when Reagan was shot, he was shot by a guy from Texas, from Dallas. I had 2 daughters that were teenagers then. They were in the same school he'd gone to. And I told Ted, I was with Ted that morning. And I said, "You won't believe this, but let me tell you about my daughters." And he said, that is really weird, Hugh. He said, well, I don't know whether he said when I get out or if I can get out, I'm gonna get someone really famous, maybe the president's daughter or somebody.
Oh my goodness, that must have been chilling.
Not really. He wasn't gonna get out.
But I
We were
mean,
in
just to
this
hear
little
him
room.
say it, that's sick.
Yeah, yeah.
Did
Well,
he escape twice?
yeah, but that was early on when.
That's before he got to Florida prison.
Yeah.
Well, his escapes were really something. He lost about 30 pounds to get out of one jail,
Right.
and went up through a air vent and over and out. And the other one, he jumped out of the second story window while he was on trial.
In Aspen, I have visited that courthouse. I saw that window he jumped out
Yeah.
of. It's a small courthouse.
But Bundy and I did not get along from that day on. And then he came up with an idea. When he thought he was going to be put to death, way back, maybe 85 or 6, he said, I wonder if I went to the governor and told him that I'd clear up a lot of this stuff if he'd let me live, or let me live for a time anyway. I said, well, I don't know Governor Martinez, but I'll go see him for you, and I'll broach the subject if you want. He said, yeah, do that. Well, I guess he got talking to his girlfriend, who later became his wife, and the next time I went to see him, he said, I never told you to do that. And I said, you son of a bitch. And I pulled up the tape and played it for him. That was a good day. He said, well, I refuse. But it was that kind of, it was really, having 2 teenage daughters and having met most of the, not most, but half a dozen to 8 victims' families, did something to me when he would act like he didn't do anything, you know. I felt sorry for him to an extent, because he had a mother that didn't know that she was probably the cause of it all.
How's that?
Well, she got pregnant and was not married. He was born in a unwed mother's home up in Connecticut. He never knew who his father really was. Well, it never came up. She moved out to Tacoma with him, married an army cook named Johnny Bundy, and Ted thought that was his real father. When he was a teenager, 14 or 15, he was up in the attic looking through old papers, found out, no, this was not his dad. Didn't know who his dad was. What papers, I don't know. And that knocked him for a loop. He took his dog, went up on a hill and stayed 2 or 3 days. And he said that was the time that I just came around in my mind. And I said, well, what do you mean, came around? He would never get too deep in his philosophy, but it was sort of sad in a way. He just never quite belonged. And yet he did, so many murders.
Now, you wrote a book about Ted Bundy.
Wrote 2 with Stephen Michaud.
Tell us about those.
Well,
The titles and if they're still in print.
one was The Only Living Witness, and that was the first one we did.
And what's the second one?
Conversations with a Killer. We wrote The Only Living Witness, and it got such acclaim, and we still probably had 30 hours of tapes that we hadn't even touched.
I still have my hardback of The Only Living Witness that you gave me.
So we went on and did this one then. We had so much left.
I have a copy of The Only Living Witness signed by the author.
There you go.
I do.
Do you know him? Do you know this guy?
I know this guy. Yeah, he's a nice guy. I really like him. We ought to interview him sometime.
Yeah.
Oh, man, we are. It's Hugh Aynesworth. I love you, Hugh. We've been through a lot together.
Been through thick and thick.
Thick and thick. Yes, we have. Let's talk about Henry Lee Lucas. How did you first become involved with Henry Lee Lucas? Oh, and I want to say, I'm sitting here with this pretty impressive notebook of all these articles and all these national and world stories that Hugh Aynesworth has been involved in and has investigated and studied and written about. It's just amazing the pictures I'm looking at in here and the memories that I'm having of things that happened so many years ago. We're talking with an incredible person here, Hugh Aynesworth, journalist extraordinaire. He thinks he's just real lucky. I think he's a hard worker.
I am
very talented.
The harder you work, the luckier you get.
That's true. That is true. Opportunities open. Now, we got a picture with Hugh a while ago with this article. How many pages was this, Hugh? 4, 6?
4, I think.
4 full-page newspaper articles. This article came out. It hit the Dallas Times-Herald about the second day of our grand jury, I believe. Yeah, April 14th, 1985. April was a busy, busy month, 1985.
Yeah.
I'll never forget that month. But I remember when we sat down in front of Henry Lucas and opened up your newspaper article for him and showed it to him. And he started going over the dates and looking back and forth between the dates and everything, and looked up and grinned and said, well, I was wondering when somebody's going to get wise to this. Yeah. Well, he had told Hugh about it way back in the beginning. And Hugh had been working on this article all the time, and it just happened to dovetail with what we were doing in Waco with the grand jury. And Hugh was a huge resource for us during the Henry Lee Lucas.
I don't think that your grand jury was convinced by me, really.
You don't think they were what?
Convinced.
Convinced. Well, you know.
I told him, I said, in a couple of 3 days, we're going to do this big story.
Yeah, they had to wait and see.
That was a lot for them to swallow.
It was a lot for them to swallow. You know, we were talking a while ago about how on the Kennedy assassination, there are so many conspiracy theories out there about all the other ways he might have been killed, and that Lee Harvey didn't do it, Lee Harvey was set up and all that. Yet on Henry Lee Lucas, it seems everybody wants to believe Henry did it. Where are the conspiracy theories here? Thank you for listening to the Vic Fizell Show podcast. And visit us at www.vicfizell.com for more information. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram.
Drive laid back and lower your speed, 1877 with Vic.